Hi, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to our February Dime Journal Club. I'm delighted to welcome Eric Perakslis to be our guest today, chatting with all of us about his recent publication. Really important work on how we need to think, I think, differently to current state around sort of how we assess not just benefits, but also the risks and the actual value of developing and deploying a variety of different digital health products. So I still see a couple of folks joining. So what I'll do, just to make everyone comfortable, if you haven't joined us before in particular for a Dime Journal Club, let me whiz through some housekeeping really briefly before I ask Eric to introduce himself. Just a quick note, full disclosure, we do record these. The conversations are terrific and we have huge access after the event. So just a heads up, we'll always disclose that we're doing that. And this will be posted to the Dime website along with the slides from today after the session. You'll see that this is not a webinar format. It's very intentionally designed as a meeting format. This is Eric's going to give some author insights into his recent work, share some of his expertise, but the majority of our time today will be spent in discussion, really with you being able to sort of drive the course of our discussion and ask Eric those questions that have been playing on your mind since you read the paper. The way you can do that, it's very participatory. Go ahead and raise your hand. You can either actually do it like this and I'll call on you. You can use the function in Zoom and then I'll unmute you. Go ahead and ask your question directly to Eric. If you are somewhere where you can't chat, you can pop your questions into the chat function or the Q&A, and then I will give voice to them on your behalf. But we do encourage a lot of discussion, and the Dime Journal Club is actually my favorite event on our roster. It's a terrific opportunity for you to get to know the experts. And with that, Eric, let me go ahead and say thank you for joining us. Your piece is terrific. It's a precursor to a book that's on the way. So perhaps you could introduce yourself to everyone, give a little bit of your background, and then you can prompt me to advance just a couple of slides before we throw it open to discussion.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me. Hey, I'm Eric. Currently, as of this week, as of yesterday, I'm the Chief Science and the Chief Digital Officer for the Duke Clinical Research Institute. For people who don't know that, that's actually the largest academic human research institute in the country. My background is pretty varied. I'm undergraduate, my master's in engineering, my PhD's in engineering, but I was actually an oral drug delivery person. So I was doing insulin blocks, artificial insulin, artificial pancreas, things like that for a long time. About 20 years in industry, a couple at FDA, about 5 years in academia, including Harvard Medical School. Where I start with stuff though like this is actually go back after my first year of university. I competed and won an internship at a local hospital. And I worked there for the summer in the engineering group and learned about medical safety, how to test beds for shocks and all these varied things. They hired me after I did well in the summer. They hired me part-time. And the next summer I spent working in the OR and anesthesia, putting in and assessing the very first pulse oximeters. So pulse oximeters are a big deal now, right? Back then they were the size of like a big textbook with a clip and a wire on them. And they were developed by anesthesiologists. A lot of people don't know this. And what we were assessing was what was their use within the operating room, because we had found out that they were such an increase to patient safety that for every operating suite, every machine, and we had 12 suites, not counting labor and delivery, where we had a pulse oximeter, the clinicians would save about $3,000 and $1,986 on their liability. And so we spent the summer going head to head. What you're going head to head against is an arterial blood gas. If anybody of you ever had to do one or had one, getting a line into an artery is quite different than getting a line into a vein. They're deeper, you can't see them. They often hurt, and now try to do that on an emaciated 90-year-old that's getting their hip replaced. And it's actually a pretty painful and difficult procedure. Not only that, but if a person moves or shifts during surgery, something like that, you can block the line. But you get all this data. You got the percent of O2 in the blood, you got partial pressures, you got pHs and things like that. Well, the pulse oximeter came along and didn't give you that. It gave you oxygen saturation, which was kind of a pseudo measure to those things. But it was real time and you could listen to it. If the sat went down, the beeping got louder and higher. And it was very intuitive to what was going on, because anesthesiologists don't necessarily believe every value, but they're really interested in trends if something's going on. So we did this all summer. We put in an arterial line, we put the thing on. I would help draw the blood. I'd take the thing, I'd run down to the laboratory with it in the ice, put it up, run back up with the results and run back and forth. And of course, in the end, what you'd expect happened, that the anesthesiologists and surgeons really liked the pulse oximeters. And what was fascinating about that use case to me is that it was clear to me, what the benefit to the patient was. They were being monitored more closely. They weren't going through a painful procedure, especially for people that were already really frail. So there was that. It was clear to me what the benefit to the clinician was. They didn't have to guess between blood draws. They had the trending gave them more real-time intuition about what was going on with that patient during surgery. They felt more in control and more attuned. And it was clear to the institution that obviously saving money on liability was great, but it also meant that it was because it was safer. And so possibly you were going to have fewer adverse events. So long story short, 35 years ago, I experienced my first truly excellent digitization use case. And I'll also say I haven't seen one quite as good since. If you really turn around and say, 3 out of 3, institution, practitioner, and patient. Don't get me wrong, there's tons of great ones. There are tons of them. But if you look at what's going on now, a lot of the solutions that are being brought out, they hit some of it. Maybe they're great for patients. Being good for one group of these people, I'm not saying that's not important. It's just different. Right. And so now that said, everything does come with a potential downside, right? So again, we weren't getting the same data. We weren't getting the data they were used to. It wasn't quite as accurate, but they did an assessment and determined that it was functionally equivalent and could work. So you can kind of pull up my slides. So the idea here and what I've seen my whole career is that, one, we really have to consider all the right stakeholders, because it's not always everybody. It could be just a clinician and a patient, not the institution, right? So just because it was a trifecta doesn't mean it was so much better. It just meant to me that was almost like, that's what 100 out of 100 looks like. And we've had lots of 90s and 95s, which are great. The other thing is that every time you do an intervention of any kind, it has downstream consequences. It kind of doesn't matter what it is. I mean, I've been in Africa doing relief work and handing out $3 mosquito nets, and if I can break out, just everything that you do has a consequence to it. And I think what can happen, and has certainly happened since what I would kind of call the vapidization of the medical discourse, which means, a lot of great stuff goes on with Twitter. A lot of stuff that isn't so great goes on with Twitter. And I'm not even talking about misinformation. I'm actually talking about people getting up and giving opinions on papers they haven't read. Things like that. The level of discourse is something we have to be more critical of in this day and age. And I think it's really easy for people to get things wrong that they don't understand, and we see it all the time. A classical one would be, I think it's very clear that a lot of people tweeting don't know the difference between FDA cleared and FDA approved, as a kind of simple example. And I'm not saying this to blame them. I'm going to get into the paper in a second, but I'm saying because there's a very important situation that exists that we may not think about all the time. And that's that healthcare and doctors and the tools that doctors and healthcare users are regulated separately. There's not overlap. So the FDA doesn't regulate medical practice. It regulates the tools, some of the tools that clinicians use. Right? And medical organizations and stuff like that don't regulate the tools, they regulate the use. And because of that, you've got these kind of sometimes non-overlapping ideas, which one can just lead to misunderstandings. A lot of clinicians might not know some of the details about FDA approval. They may have never worked on it or may have never worked in research, as an example. And similarly, we know for a fact, if you look at Silicon Valley, a lot of people working on tools don't necessarily understand medicine all that well. So you can stick up. I don't know. Is the thing up? Is that a question?
Eric, I'm talking to myself. I think I'm sharing slides. I've got the key takeaways up and can move to the next one if you prefer.
Okay, I actually
nope, we're not seeing it.
I can't see it. Yeah. So
I apologize. Give me 2 seconds. I thought I'd been sharing all this time and was obviously very wrong. Terrific. Can you see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. Apologies.
Yeah, so just like I even said, so first of all medical interventions have consequences. Those consequences, some can be unexpected. frankly, as somebody who researched this a lot for a book that's coming out in a couple of months, traditionally it's been far more easy to demonstrate and quantify benefits than risks. And that's because the risks often happen in other systems. So for example, the classical example within drug pharmacovigilance will be an arthritis medicine that had unintended cardiovascular toxicities. The people studying that drug at the time, go back, a decade or two, weren't really looking at the circulatory system. They were really looking at, is it the type of toxicities you'd expect in arthritis. And I think, when you talk about digital health, when is somebody getting their identity stolen, an adverse event of being in a clinical trial? I mean, I know that if it was me, I would actually be bothered a lot more by a bad credit finding than if I had a headache for 6 hours after having a procedure, and it might have larger consequences, right? So the idea these risks may often manifest in systems other than the primary location or mechanism of action. And the way I talk about this with often is that, the idea here that when you take humans in any form in their behavior and or sensors directly connected to them and you put those on the internet, you're kind of opening a door to whatever the possible harms of the internet are. Now, in lots of cases, this is 1000% the right thing to do because of the medical benefit risk, and we see that all the time. But sometimes it's not. And the reason why we were asked to write the paper is because for folks possibly like the folks around this call that are very technophilic, we get this stuff. But one of the reasons why the paper was solicited was JAMA feeling that the average practicing family doctor might not have an understanding of a lot of these things. And if you've got your 75-year-old AFib patient coming in and saying, should I spend $1,000 on that Apple Watch to watch my AFib? Does the clinician feel like they know how to answer that question well? The other thing is that, digital health is different. I think, as I said, because it's connected to the internet, I think it's especially important. The other thing here is that, when you look at tools, and if you take medical devices for a second, they're absolutely have been historically regulated based on context of use and skill. So for example, you think about approving a surgical laser. If a new surgical laser gets approved, it's done under the context that the clinicians using that surgical laser have had certain types of training, hours of training, use, and those types of things. We haven't really gotten there with some of the digital health tools. They're kind of, there's this hybrid going on between the consumer electronics market and the medical device market, and that just has left some people unsure about these types of things. So I do think context, it doesn't mean the device is bad, but a person could make a mistake with that device. So for a classic example of that would be, people that have read some of the Apple Heart Watch papers on something like potentially overdiagnosis or fear of overdiagnosis, or even hypochondria, where people see these events on their watch and they're, not sure what to do with them. Obviously, I think at this point we can understand that it's actually beyond technology and health literacy at this point. It's actually also belief systems in this country, especially in this country right now with respect to science and medicine, that ideology may be as large a factor in people's beliefs as literacy. That said, the reason why I bring this up, and let me be really clear about this in case you're all like really packing your powder down and getting ready to fire here, is that I actually want this stuff to be used and to be used well. And so my view on this is because we understand the hazards of connecting things to the internet, we shouldn't be making the easy rookie mistakes here. We should be smarter than that. We should have the opportunity to put these things out and not have to learn by practice that people need some privacy training to go with that tool, or people need to understand that if they connect that device to their smartphone, that they're expanding their attack surface or whatever needs to be done. So the idea here is I'm not talking about unintended harms. I'm talking about the ones that we know will happen. When I had the first paper, actually co-paper, we were two papers in the very first time the New England Journal of Medicine ever wrote about cybersecurity. It was the summer of 2014, well before WannaCry. And I had submitted that paper 6 months earlier. People just didn't know if cyber threat was going to be a real thing in healthcare. And so again, being proactive isn't about slowing digital health. It's about enabling realistic value minimum setbacks. And value is important because, one of the things that's been interesting about COVID has been trying to understand what has now happened with consumerism in medicine. People are kind of choosing what they do. It used to be I had an appointment for that. Well, that got canceled because of COVID. And, do I really feel like I still need to have my knee scoped? It doesn't hurt today. Maybe I won't have it scoped, right? And so the more and more as healthcare gets virtual, the more and more consumerism is sneaking into medicine. Although I'm not a big fan of the idea of medicine of patients being consumers, only because I feel simply too many patients don't really have a choice about seeking care. They're in a vulnerable position and they have to seek care. So you can go to the next thing. So this is just a little rubric we put up there, and it was just it's really was just meant to kind of give an idea that value, benefit, risk, and how these things in some ways kind of interact when you're looking at things. They're hugely personal. Take a couple of examples. If you have a young, otherwise healthy, newlywed guy who is just diagnosed at 31 years old with MS, and they're looking down the barrel of this horrible disease, and they're hugely athletic, and the new wife, and everything going for them. These are people that are probably want to be very proactive about their care. They want every minute they're watched to be doing step tests and seeing if they're getting worse, and they can kind of build a life around that. If you're an hourly worker and you don't have a safety net, and you're being told, you have to go do this COVID home test or you lose your job at Walmart, that's a tough situation. And I think we have to understand, the way these technologies and, especially being used in a home sense have huge consequences. So anyway, that's the point of it. The point of it is that, benefit and risk, we know how to calculate these. Risks often aren't found out till later, mainly because we don't know. You find side effects years and years after a drug is out because you didn't know. And value, because of money, needs to be here now, as we know that a lot of people can't afford healthcare today. And so putting pressure on them to adopt even more tools they can't afford wouldn't be taking things in the right direction. But that's my riff, 10-minute riff, whatever.
Eric, that was absolutely perfect. And my apologies again to you, Eric, and also everyone on the line. I did think I was sharing the slides, and I apologize for that. At this point, let's throw it open for some questions for Eric. I am looking at the Q&A, and I'm looking at chat and raised hands. So definitely, I've unintentionally or intentionally stopped sharing now. So we can have a nice conversation. I welcome questions for Eric. I've got like a laundry list here, but I want to throw it open to the floor first.
Okay.
Eric, maybe I'll get us started. One of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit, and I've had the privilege of learning from you on these topics for a while now. For a while, I would bang this drum on like, well, we need to redefine patient safety. Patient safety is something that our clinical colleagues really understand. And then I actually went to the WHO definition of patient safety, and it's quite lovely, and I think it holds. And the piece that's important, and I think that you tease this out really nicely in this paper, is I believe it uses the language known risk, or something about sort of our current understandings of risk. And as you mentioned, the folks on the line here, we probably are a lot more eyes wide open to the risks that accompany, using a digital health technology that's connected to the internet, these sort of new tranches of risk. You also said that sort of digital health, the very broad application, sort of explodes the context of use, and the and known risk is going to be very different to different people. How do we start to create a system where we can support people in making sort of decisions about whether something is safe for them or for their patients?
Yeah. There was the 20th anniversary of our paper this year, and it actually was, there was an editorial right before mine or after in JAMA. It's not do no harm, but it was 20 years of something harm. Anyway, it was a National Academies paper that actually talked about safety in healthcare, and it was kind of like the paper that everybody referenced over the last 20 years, and they updated it. And in that update, they actually make some of the points that you make, that to account for new types of risk. I think first and foremost, when the co-author of my book was my chief information security officer at FDA, and is currently currently a professional at the Department of Homeland Security, doing cyber defense and whatnot. And the chapter in the book that we have that talks about this, and the only reason I'm bringing it up is because, when you think about cyber, you talk to people and they'll talk about known knowns and known unknowns and all of those types of things. I actually think that rubric works really well for medical safety. When you think about, so for example, the known knows in hospital, slips and falls and these types of things, cyber events, identity theft like that, those should be slid into the known knowns, I think, with respect to how institutions look at risk. The known unknowns, I think we have to find out experientially what's going to kind of go on, right? Because some of this is a great human experiment and we'll learn it as we go. But I do believe that the known knowns, the things that we know should be accounted for very quickly. So for example, one of the things that I would love to see when I read like I was recently asked to comment on the Illume test that was $231 million from the administration was spent yesterday to procure these Illume home COVID tests for wide distribution, which I think is a great move forward. I had been asked about a month prior to that by NPR to kind of look at the technology around this particular test. And what was interesting of it is that it's a test like a pregnancy test. You put a sample in it, you connect it Bluetooth your phone. When you see the result, it has already transmitted the results of the manufacturer with like your date of birth and a little bit of information. There was nothing in the EUA about privacy. And so for me, when, I think it's important to get these technologies out there. I don't think it would be a bad idea for regulators to have paragraphs in these emergency use authorizations about the privacy impacts and what the best policies are, because it's a known. So that's so an example. Same thing if you looked at back a while ago when Andy Carrados and I had a piece in Lancet where we talked about the original AFib detection feature approval. There wasn't anything on that authorization letter. So I just think, it's not a big deal. We know we should be talking about it, and as you know, what patients get when they go to the clinic is they get more or less the equivalent of a EULA, which is really protecting the organization, not them a lot of the time. So I think we can do better than that.
Eric, that's a great answer. And I want to, if I can, sort of, Casey, see if you have any thoughts on this, because the known knowns, I just put in my notes, sort of who's responsible for that, right? You offered a really terrific suggestion that FDA put something in the label or whatever that looks like around privacy, but currently no one's responsible for that. And Casey, my mind always goes to the patient bears the burden right now of having to assess the majority of this, especially when this the use of these tools are happening outside of the clinic and outside of the oversight of a clinician. I wonder if this is something the patient community is talking about much, and whether there are any sort of suggestions.
Well, I mean, we're not talking specifically about EUAs, although, I mean, we do, but we don't talk specifically about privacy in EUAs a lot. It's there, but it's not, it's not on our number one bullet. It's, further down. But I will just make an observation that is based on news of the day over the last, let's say, 48 hours. And this is not about healthcare privacy. This is about privacy as understood by the end user, which is the patient in this particular case, or as I like to call them, people. But Apple has introduced a privacy nutrition label in their app store at, somewhere on the screen. I don't have an Apple phone, so I can't speak to, I'm sure you can find screen caps out there. But their app store now has a privacy, like a nutrition label for the user to look at and, easily scan. It's a pictograph. With some, language on it so that you understand that, if red is good or not or whatever. But they have a nutrition label on there, which gives people the option of figuring out whether or not they want to install this. Now, there has to be some other education around that. You can't just like throw up a nutrition label. You also need to know who's building that nutrition label. Because, do you trust the person who built that? I don't know. If it's, the sugar lobby, has had a little too much say in some of the nutrition labeling stuff, maybe not, but the sugar lobby is not germane here. But I do think that building tools, first requiring EUAs to at least have something in there about what the privacy rules are, what data of yours is being shared, how they're preserving privacy and security of that data, or is it just going out to every, jackass on the internet, which, with federal procurement stuff around IT, like, what was it? I think we need, the other issue, which is Facebook ad targeting directly to active duty military personnel. But anyway, it's like, I could talk about this for weeks. I'll shut up now. But EUAs could usefully employ clear privacy notices and maybe a nutrition label on privacy and data security.
It's a great point. And also, you point to the other thing, and, I think, again, COVID has kind of given us a great view on this, and that's the digital divide that, between Android and Apple. And, there's a very huge, well-documented socioeconomic, ethnic, and other rates, and they do have very different privacy practices. And, there are great solutions on both of them for different things. But as a consumer, a lot of people don't have a choice about which one they're able to use.
Jordan, I don't know if you're somewhere where you can speak. I wonder how you think about sort of where you sit, considering sort of risk benefits as Eric has outlined them. I've learned a lot from you, Jordan, about how you sort of evaluate the value of these tools in clinical practice. Does this jive with your thinking? Are there other things that you consider?
Yeah, Jennifer, it's very much evolving. And hello, everyone. This is Jordan Silverman. I work on the digital care delivery team at Anthem, and also we are standing up a digital health evidence committee. And personally, I'm very concerned, Eric, about some of the issues you've raised around digital iatrogenicity. I certainly have observed cases, for example, one that stands out where you've got a digital health app trying to promote physical activity, and we're monitoring physical activity with an activity tracker. And what we find is not so much that we increase physical activity, but that we increase engagement with an app. So basically, we've gotten people who we actually see physical activity going down. I've seen, and so you try to get people to be more active, and what you end up doing is you get them to basically use their smartphone more. And so things like that really concern me. What I would love is a set of risks to look for, like the one I just mentioned, or Eric, like the cybersecurity challenges you have mentioned. What I haven't seen from a digital risk perspective is that list of things we really should be thinking about. What are the known risks that we should consider as we evaluate digital health interventions? What are your thoughts, Eric?
So Quinn Centerline, actually, I was given the opportunity, but I avoided adding a picture of the book that's coming out. So the book that we have coming out, my co-author and I, in early April through Oxford University Press, is actually a framework for assessing benefit risk of digital health. And we both qualitatively and quantitatively provide models of thought, and actually some math if you want to do it, to understand how, like, in a clinical setting, introducing a new technology would change the risk profile of that setting. And again, we hope that it's a guide for patients and clinicians, but also for practitioners to kind of look at this and say, okay, that's not a bad checklist. It may not be exhaustive, but it's more than I thought of before, right? So in a book like this, you can't be perfect, but we wrote it, Jordan, because of what you just said and us feeling the same way, that this just didn't exist anywhere, and somebody had to take the first crack at writing it down. So shameful plug for the book, but it's my honest answer.
Fantastic.
Terrific. And Jordan, it's a great example. And I think, Eric, it just goes back to those sort of, be eyes wide open to those downstream effects. Smit, I don't know if you're somewhere where you can talk right now. You've as a trained clinician, to what extent are you getting insights or information, if at all, through your sort of clinical training, whether that's current training or whether that's sort of ongoing CE?
Yeah, it's very interesting that right now there's a lack of understanding, one, and two, lack of structure behind those training. I'm a pharmacist by training. I'll be a pharmacist in the next 2 or 3 months, but when we look at it right now, I'm in an ambulatory care setting for this month of rotations, and we were trying to, we have funding for new digital technology to bring in. It's in a rural setting and we want to implement that. But essentially we lack the framework in terms of the site does not know, like I talked to their chief medical officer yesterday, we were in a meeting, they have the funding, they know that they want to implement these devices and they want to use it for remote patient monitoring, but they don't know how to do that. And I think the essential framework, they know that there are some concerns from the privacy side, but just beyond those normal terms, we do not know what goes behind it. And I think a lot of clinicians like me for future, or so many other clinicians, are looking forward towards how to do it, essentially. They know what to do it and what that process looks like, so they don't go in a hole, but probably go forward towards helping the patients in the most effective and the better way.
That's good. You know, when I get asked that, is it okay, Jen, if I chime in there?
Oh, please, yes.
You know what I get? I have this same answer that I learned in 1986, and that's only do it if you're solving a real problem. You know, and I know that sounds really kind of trite and, you know, like virtue signaling and stuff like that, but it's really the idea that, because there's plenty of them. You know, there's so many unsolved problems right now that, you know, when you find that tool, and again, whether it's a trifecta or whether it's a, you know, 2 out of 3, or whether it's a really needed 1 out of 3, right? But kind of go after that, because the rest of it will take care of itself. The benefit risk equation will balance itself out. You know, when you really look at these things, if you're solving a real problem, the opposite's also true. If there isn't any benefit, then no amount of risk should be tolerable in the equation, right? It's like dividing by 0. You can't do it because it's, you know, it's like, why take any risk at all if you're not getting anything out of that? And I do think that where we are, and so maybe the last math, is that we're in the boundary condition stage where we're trying to find opportunities going to be clear. So for example, if you look at another important area in healthcare right now in research is real world evidence versus clinical trial data, where we were able to show real world evidence was useful in clinical trials is when we didn't have enough patients to randomize in rare diseases. In that case, we had to use synthetic control arms because there wasn't a way to do the trial. Right, so you know, those cases exist, and they're I always say they're like, you know, when you do a jigsaw puzzle as a kid, you find all the flat pieces first. You know, find those use cases and lay those out. You can fill in the hard stuff in the middle, but if you find those use cases, you're going to do it. You're going to learn from it. You're going to encourage the organization forward, and you'll be positive, as opposed to the, hey, I have a shiny new thing. What's the problem I can solve with it? Nothing wrong with people trying to develop new ideas. Innovation is essential, but I do think that when you've got a different problem on your hands, it may not be helpful to solve one you don't have. And then, you know, the only thing I might say generally about risk is, should the default setting to the internet really be on in technology? You know, as a default setting, should it really be on, or possibly should it be off? And we, you know, kind of like allow app to track me when I'm using the app, right? Shouldn't this kind of be a little bit more the way it works, as opposed to, you know, too much? So
I love that. So Smith, great insights from sort of the clinical perspective, and Eric, I love the provocative example that shouldn't be provocative around, you know, we know that sort of behavioral economics works, and it goes back to, I think, you know, the responsibility here. Obviously the reason to default it is for anyone who's trying to vacuum up that data, it's hugely beneficial, but who's responsible for making those decisions, and who's responsible for putting the patient at the center? Andre, there's a question from you in the chat. Are you somewhere where you want to ask your question directly?
Me?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, I have one question. Do you consider telemedicine and telehealth as part of digital health, or is just outside of it, out of the
personally, I do. Yeah. Huh? The way I had a blog on this yesterday at Duke. The way I'm defining digital health, which I do define as different from digital medicine, right, is the way I'm doing it, and because every definition needs a frame, right? The way I'm framing it is anything to do with healthcare that's directly connectable to the internet. Is the way I'm doing it, and it's only because that's the thematic way I've decided to cover it. There are lots of other definitions that are better and more well written, but that's the way I'm doing it. And especially something like telehealth, which clearly is enabling a change of the fundamental way healthcare happens, which is awesome. It's a good thing. So
okay.
yeah.
Yeah. No, it's because I thought in the definition it was not mentioned. Yeah. And just one comment: if you would have to go back again to Africa, can you give us some thoughts about digital health?
Sure.
I guess if we are very experimental in developing world in conflict area, it's going to be very difficult. Digital health and implementation in certain conflict areas of Africa. But what about telemedicine or telehealth? How would you see it? How do you start? Would you start on health literacy or digital literacy? How would you start if you go back? Yeah.
So I have a review paper in the journal Conflict and Health on this. That's open access. You know, maybe Jen, you can pull it or something like that. And I actually go through all varied forms of digital. My answer on this is that these settings, having worked in them extensively, have very specific circumstances around them. But you know what? Depending upon the intervention, it may actually be safer. So, for example, in a conflict like I was working with a Rohingya fleeing Myanmar, having a lot of paper records around after an intervention of who had done what and who got paid and who did what was actually potentially problematic if something like that was left behind. But with digital, we were able to make sure we kind of understood the extent of things. At the same time, yes, pushing the wrong technology at the wrong time to the wrong customer base is bad. But I got to tell you, it is way easier on a flip phone in most parts of Africa to order a pizza than it is in the U.S. And so it's amazing how astute they are. But I really recommend the paper because it's a real important topic, and it really required that 5,000 word review to figure it out. But it's about 4 years old, but I still think it's reasonable.
Eric, you've mentioned some terrific resources. What we'll do before we post the slides, and actually, Casey, you popped it in. Thank you in the chat. We'll make sure we sort of highlight some resources that we've discussed today. And Andre, thank you so much for a great question. Michelle Holko, I wonder if you're somewhere where you can chat. You've thought about this a lot. You've integrated wearable technologies into the All of Us study. It's a phenomenal resource to the community because the data is being made available for sort of ongoing research. How did you guys tackle, if you can talk about it, sort of the issue of risk benefit and making the decisions around which technology to use, how and who to deploy it with, how to make the data available?
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That's a great question. And all of those decisions actually happened in the program before I joined. Basically what the decision was to they are moving into a phase now where they're going to be deploying devices, and there is interest within the program to do that. But instead of doing that initially, what they did was basically allow people who already had devices to start to share those data with the program. So it's a bring your own device model at the moment, and with connections to Fitbit and Apple Health Kit. The other thing that we've done from a security and privacy perspective is we do not collect any geolocation information at all. We do collect minute level heart rate and minute level activity data, as well as the summary for all of those. And that is what is being, those parsed out in data tables is what's being shared with researchers in the researcher workbench as of December 2020. So it's quite a lot of data, right? And there is some concern about privacy, even with that. But there are a lot of other checks in the database about binning individuals. You actually can't get their addresses down to the census tract level. You can only go down to zip code. So there are a lot of different kind of ways that the data are blurred to hopefully protect privacy. But at the same time, we have a team that is basically trying to hack into it, from the NIH side into the researcher workbench that's being housed and built at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. But it's such an important issue that I've actually moved. I'm no longer, my full details no longer at NIH with the All of Us. I'm still a Presidential Innovation Fellow, but I've moved over to CISA to work on cybersecurity issues related to healthcare, especially in light of the COVID crisis. And so, we're working a lot of supply chain, as well as, kind of other cybersecurity issues related to healthcare, as well as the bioeconomy.
Michelle, thank you. And I did put you on the spot there, but that was a terrific answer. And you actually brought up something that I think I'd love to hear from Eric, and Michelle definitely sort of respond to it again as the conversation goes on. Eric, Michelle brought up some great examples of not just sort of making an effort to do intentional decision making up front, but mechanisms along the way, like, trying to do the sort of the white hat hacking, right? The engaging the security research community once it's active to ensure safety down the road. How does that play into a broader strategy, not just one-time decision making, but ongoing decision making and activities?
So it's a great question. There's two things to think about there. One, I don't believe there is a technology that can be future-proofed. I just don't think that, and so and it's our own brilliance that's at fault maybe, but it is what it is. So I think first of all, so ongoing is always important. In fact, if you look at something like WannaCry, right? One of the real interesting lessons there was that, most of the things that went down were the things that were more than 5 or 6 years old. And if you look at what Microsoft, as an example, if you look at the patches they push, something like 70% of them are for systems that are more 4 years older than more. So the older it's been out there, the more people have had a chance to test it, the more people know what the vulnerabilities are, et cetera. So you have to kind of, you need to kind of bend that curve the other way with testing. That said, I think that, maybe it's a good time to bring up something else. One of the things about safety with these devices is actually, beyond the cyber part of privacy, is actually the context of use by the user. I actually think the Dexcom outage was a really important view of this. For people that don't know, Dexcom more or less has a kind of a closed loop, insulin measure and injection device, right? So kind of a external closed loop pancreas, and it sets alerts. It gives alerts so the parents can know if the sugar is doing something that it possibly shouldn't be doing. I grew up, one of my best friends had a type 1 diabetic child, and I don't think this guy slept for 12 years because he was up 4 times a night checking this child's sugar. Well, here's the thing with the Dex. So I think Thanksgiving weekend 2 years ago, the alert system at Dexcom went down. And so think about it for a second. What does that mean? It means that parents who had gotten in the habit of not checking something because they knew they would get an alert didn't know if they weren't getting an alert. And there was a real outrage over this, and it was a whole big thing, and Dexcom did a good job fixing it. But it's an interesting thing. If you read everything that Dexcom puts out there, they label this as convenience, not life support. But if you read some of the parents' remarks, to them, they had gotten to the point where they were using it almost more like life support. And so that's a good example of a situation where everybody actually is doing what they should have done, but there's a possibility for misunderstanding and context of use to get in a way that might be really dangerous, because you no longer ever check your child's blood sugar at night. And if the device went down 2 days ago, you don't know if their sugar spiked or crashed. So that's why I think the context of use thing and the education thing is really, really big when it comes to the safety of these devices.
All right, that's a terrific example. And I think increasingly so, as we're seeing the occasional sort of commercial technology pursue a clearance. And, in those cases, sometimes it's even, there's only a cleared piece of software on a given technology product. So the interpretation of that, the burden of interpretation sort of on the end user who can still buy the product in like sort of Best Buy or over the internet is challenging. Michelle, did you want to follow up on that? I didn't want to cut you off there.
Yeah. No, you didn't. One other thing though that, this conversation is making me think of is the fact that one of the things that we noticed when we started looking at the bring your own device data in the All of Us research program was that there was a true bias, to people, not diverse populations, not diverse communities in the data set. And so, that's been one of the focuses is to try to figure out, okay, so how do we mitigate that? And I think that coming back to this, kind of education piece, but it has to be in a way that meets people where they are in terms of the technology that they have, the health interests that they have in terms of their own health. But it's something that I think that we need to see a lot more of more broadly, as you know, as you're talking about, Eric, but also, you know, with diversity in mind.
Absolutely. The digital divide, I think, is something that's really important, and it strikes socioeconomically, education-wise. You know, there's all these different things to it, and I do think that you know, every time we do the experiment like that, I think we see clear disparities in it, and I do think people are getting better at trying to design that out. But then those, you know, it's interesting because when you try to design out a disparity, now you're directly intervening too, which is, it gets more complex for something like all of us. But it's an important point. I agree. You know.
If I can intervene, Jen, real quick, piggybacking on Eric's example, and it's perfect and very timely because we had picked up an example of Dexcom and we had compared it with Libre. So if people know, Libre is more connected than compared to the Dexcom. So I was curious about, to Eric's question and thought, how do we see the decision-making power from the insights that are being generated from these digital tools to go in patients' hands versus to go in clinicians' hands, and what that distribution looks like? And that was one of the discussions we were having, and I would love to hear more thoughts.
Yeah. So, you know, so for example, in the title of our book, we put for patients and providers for the exact reason you just said, is because I actually think at any given time, it could be either or both that's involved in a conversation. And so and in some ways, there's a level at which the questions are actually the same. Even though they have very different knowledge and very different experience and very different things in their heads, there are points which are just beautiful golden communication moments where the questions are exactly the same. Like, you know, talking to your endocrinologist about the Libre versus the Dexcom and stuff like that. And, you know, I mean, it's good that we have several of these things. They're always going to try to one up each other and be better. The big thing is making sure people understand what safe use of it is. You know, these things just happen. You know, when I was, shortly after my time in the hospital, I was also working home care, and I was working on the very first monitors for sudden infant death syndrome, where they would basically put an apnea monitor on a belt. And then of course, kids started strangling themselves in those cords at night. You know, so again, every intervention, whether you think about it or not, you know, you find out that you end up having these risks. So I do think it is a clinician, patient, or provider, clinician or caregiver conversation. But you know what, most docs I know probably don't have that handy dandy 8x10 comparing those two devices to sit down with the patient with, right? So they're reading it on an airplane or something, or on their own, and trying to self-interpret it. And I do think that's one of the great opportunities is for a different approach to clinician and patient education on these.
Love that. Thank you.
That's a great example, and another one. And then Meredith, will come to you. I have some friends who work in the emergency department, and their sort of reaction is, if another patient comes in and tells me they have AFib in the ED during COVID, I'm going to throw myself out of the window. And it's really challenging, right? Because the information and what you have to back up the information, and information versus diagnosis, for example, is challenging.
Well, it's interesting because direct-to-consumer advertising laws do not apply to these devices right now. They apply to drugs, right, and certain things. But should, you know, if you look at direct to consumer, you know, should maybe a form of it, I don't know, you know, to device manufacturers, it's something we talk about a little bit.
Yeah, and I guess kind of my question along those lines too is how does like the third party payer get involved in this too, where potentially like an employer is paying for a product and giving it to their employees? Like how do we think about it, or want to get your thoughts on that?
So it's a great question. So my belief, and actually my very strong hope, you know, the humans on the planet right now that I think are doing the best job with value in healthcare are payers, because they're having to make these decisions. And I really hope it's true for digital health as well. You know, I really hope that they'll do what they do with other things, and saying, you know, this warrants a biopsy, this doesn't warrant a biopsy. Not that anybody likes being told what to do by payers, but hopefully it's a dialogue. And I think the payers, you know, we know how important that CMS and other data like that is for driving good health policy. And I hope that this feeds that, because I think payers are the only ones that really have the incentive to measure value as well as value can be measured, because nobody else kind of has that incentive. So I'm very hopeful on that.
Fantastic. Meredith, that was a great question. I am very conscious that we all exist in the era of back-to-back-to-back Zoom calls. So in the spirit of that, Eric, I want to, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I'm saying these things out loud, so I'm conscious that I'm doing it. Eric, this was absolutely tremendous. We were able to touch on such a wide variety of issues and probe this from different stances. And there are not many experts out there who are able to address all of these questions. So thank you so much for joining us today. For folks who dialed in, as I said, we will post both, we will post both the recording, and we're going to update the slides to include some of the resources that we shared, and also, Eric, the link to your new book. Jordan, that was a question that you asked, and hopefully a good resource for the community. Just for folks to give you a quick line of sight on what else we have coming up this month, our webinar for February is an event we're putting on with our partners at Startup Health. We're going to be thinking about what they describe as health moonshots. How do we improve global access to care with digital medicine? So Eric will be taking, I'm sure, into the Q&A some of what we've learned today. So we've got Miguel Johns, Brian Mizzou, and Ariva Martin joining us, and that looks to be a terrific event. So I hope many of you can join us. But Eric, again, thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise, and everyone on the line. This was phenomenal because of your participation. Really appreciate it. I learned a lot, and a well-spent lunchtime at my end for sure.
Thanks, everybody. Stay well. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.